Hello and welcome to LawPod. I'm Dr. Rosie Cowan, a lecturer in the law school, and I'm here with Eva Richards, one of our student LawPod team, and we're going to be chatting to Eoin Campbell. Eoin is a lecturer at Lyon University in France, and the subject of our talk today is the duty to intervene if someone is in danger, the duty to help. In UK law, there is no general duty to help, apart from certain specific situations, but in France, there is, it's part of the penal code, that you should help strangers in danger. Eoin has a very personal story to tell about this, which he's going to share with us now.
Thanks very much for the introduction, Rosie. Yeah, and thanks to Queen's University for having me here on this visit. I've been a resident in Lyon in France since 2008. I'm a Queen's graduate, graduated with a law degree here in, I think, 2003 maybe. And then 2006 I graduated then from the Institute as a solicitor. After a very, very brief career practicing as a solicitor, I ran away to France, where I began a career in legal education. So I largely teach legal English and some basic common law classes to the law students in the Université Catholique de Lyon. So to get to my own story, it was the 16th of November 2022. I was leaving the university after a long day of classes. And so I got on the tramway, which would usually take me home. At my own stop, I entered a residential car park. And that car park, it's not the one that's adjoined to my building, but it's one I would use on a daily basis as a shortcut home. A lot of people would use that, given its proximity to the tramway. That happens very commonly. And as I entered this car park, I noticed quite a strange individual. Just his demeanour, his behaviour, everything about him seemed slightly off. This was in November. It was fairly mild for November. But this young chap, he appeared to be wearing nothing but a jalaba. In the neighbourhood that I'm talking about, there'd be a lot of people of North African origin, so a young man wearing a jalaba is in no way unusual, but this guy, he was not wearing a jacket over it. He did not seem to be wearing any under it. He didn't even seem to have trousers on. As he was walking through the car park, I wasn't initially paying a lot of attention to him. I think I probably wanted to avoid attracting his attention because he did look strange. But he approached a young woman who had entered the car park from the other side. This would be a young lady of about 21, 22. And I remember thinking that she resembled any one of my students at the university. And this guy approached her and he spoke to her. And she stopped and she seemed to be taking out her ear pods or something so that she could hear him. And at this point he grabbed her. By now I was paying more close attention to the incident because something seemed very, very off indeed. And he grabbed her quite roughly and I shouted over to him. The French have a very formal manner of speaking. Not like we would say around here would be, do you know that fella, love? Or how we would speak maybe around Belfast. But the French would all be very formal. So I said, Madame, do you know that man? And just as she was saying no, he struck her quite forcefully with an open hand. I could hear the slap. So she was a very small girl and a very nasty, open-handed slap. And he'd sort of caught her with the side of his hand. It was really a nasty blow. So clearly something terrible was happening. So I ran over towards him. And by the time I'd reached him, he was strangling her. He was standing behind her and he was choking her with like an MMA grip. It was both forearms around her neck, one arm closer to the other and the other one reinforcing the grip. And he was choking her very forcefully. Now, fortunately, this time there'd been another chap had also entered the car park. It turned out he was a guy who lived in the building. These two people lived in the building, the girl and the assailant. So all three, apart from myself, lived in that building. They didn't know each other. There was no prior relationship. But this other chap came running over and he was a Croatian gentleman. And he was a big, strong fellow himself. So we basically began sort of trying to pull him off or trying to pull his arms off. And he performed what I described to the police as a backflip. He threw himself backwards onto his own shoulders which he must have hurt himself, because this is the car park, remember? So he landed in the tarmac at him of the car park with great force, and the girl, she came down on top of him. And basically, they're both staring upwards, if you like. He's lying at back, she's facing upwards, and he's choking her with his forearms. So myself and the Croatian guy, we dropped onto the ground on top of them and trying to pull his arms off, but he had really great force at this point. Very, very forceful grip he had on her. Thankfully, the Croatian guy, he managed to get his top arm up. Okay, he managed to pull the top arm off. It was the left arm, I believe. And then he just pinned that arm to the ground. It revealed the side of his face. And from there, I sort of leaned over across him, and I began to strike him with my right hand. But this guy, he didn't really seem to feel the pain. That didn't register with him. The second to last shot, I seemed to hurt him. You'd see a sort of flash in his face. And then the final shot, I had been hitting his cheekbone. And the final shot, the way his face I missed slightly. And I caught him with the lower part of my hand, the lower part of my fist. And with that strike, I hurt my hand. Now, thankfully, though, that final strike, it also hurt him, and he released her. And the girl jumped up. We had to hold him down in a crucifix position, if you like. And he was shouting and roaring about the end of the world and earthquakes, all of this. Very, very confused and rambling type of conversation. And when we were looking in his eyes, it was really quite clear that he was in a second state, or he was really very, very deeply disturbed. So we asked the young lady, I screamed at her to call the police. And she was so upset that she couldn't actually remember the phone number, even though she was French herself. My Croat friend, thankfully, he was a bit calmer than me. And he fairly politely reminded her what the number was. And she called the police, and then the police showed up actually very quickly. Very, very quickly. And I was quite surprised how quickly they showed up. And that became apparent why the next day. And the reason they showed up so quickly was because they'd already been circling the neighbourhood looking for this guy, because he had actually carried a series of assaults. He had started in a filling station up the road, about 500 metres up the road. There was a filling station, and he'd been behaving erratically and aggressively in the filling station. The manager of the shop at that filling station, he put him out of his shop. He saw he was trouble. He was being very loud, rude, obnoxious, and he told him to get out. Forcefully removed him from his shop. And sadly, what he'd done on the forecourt of that filling station, he attacked an old woman. The lady was about 70 years old. He attacked her really violently, and unfortunately, she was on her own. That poor lady, she ended up in a coma for, I believe, a number of weeks. She did come out of the coma, thankfully, but she was very badly hurt. And two guys in the shop, thankfully, they did see this happening. Now, unfortunately, they were too far away to stop it happening, but they managed to chase him off, and they got help for the old lady. But again, that was another factor in what came next, because they were too busy helping the old lady to chase him down or try and restrain him. The priority was to try and get her help, which is completely understandable. So he proceeded on down the roads, and they gathered from the police reports later, he attacked several other people.
You think that the young lady that you helped, Eoin, was the fifth victim?
Yeah, I believe so, yes.
Yeah.
She was the fifth person.
And tell me, when you saw what was happening, you believed that this young lady was about to die?
I have no doubt whatsoever he's going to kill her. That's really quite certain. Her own police statements, as she said, that she hit a point where she couldn't breathe at all. Initially, obviously, she was screaming and crying. She was really, obviously, in a dreadful panic. When I started hitting them, it was really quite frantic, because we couldn't hear her scream anymore, because there was no breath left, So it was a really, really, really horrible experience, There was no doubt about that, and I think that was later recognised in the court papers. That basically the court ruled was that he would have killed her, but for the intervention of myself and the Croat gentleman.
Before you intervened, I'm just wondering what your considerations were. You saw she was in danger.
I got off a tramway and I was walking home. My consideration was, should I go for a run this evening, or maybe I should go to the gym? I haven't been in a couple of... And then you see this very odd scenario starting to emerge. It sounds like a cliche when people say, it happened very quickly, but it did. You see something like that. No, you can't walk past that.
I mentioned earlier that the French have a law in their penal code which says that you have a duty to intervene if you can, but that there is no need to put yourself at risk.
Yeah.
I guess this wasn't running through your mind at that instant.
No, that doesn't really come up. And I said that really came up later, if you like, when I submitted a compensation claim, because I quite badly injured my hand in that incident. It ended up, I had a rupture to the fifth tendon, the pinky finger, if you like, on my right hand, which is my dominant hand. And I ended up being immobilized for 6 weeks. And then there was like 10 weeks of physiotherapy. And it was quite a bad injury. And I've still got a permanent problem. I don't have the same grip as before. And it cramps quite a bit. And my wrist clicks an awful lot and cracked to my wrist, And I was later diagnosed with PTSD. And all of this led to a loss of earnings in that I would often do quite a bit of work over the summertime. Our semesters in France tend to be quite short, but the wages wouldn't be as big in a French university, the UK equivalent. There's a lot of swings and roundabouts. So I'm not going to cry poverty. You get different advantages here and there in the French system. It's just a different system, if you like, but it's sort of normal that most of us work in the university would be doing different types of overtime across the summer. And given the sick leave that I had to sign out for, I couldn't do any of that.
And so all this time you were under a legal duty, really, to intervene in that car park. I'm curious how you would explain that duty to someone who maybe had just moved over from a common law jurisdiction that doesn't have that.
Well, here, in any jurisdiction, there'll be certain obligations that you have to protect people, but in our tradition, they're a little bit more specific. Okay, so say, for example, if you're a parent, you have a duty to protect your own child, or if you're a
guardian,
you're a guardian,
yeah.
or if you're the babysitter of a child, that you're responsible for that child during that period. So, for example, you'd have to prevent that child from running out in the road in front of the car. You've got a responsibility to do that. Now, that doesn't mean you'd always be at fault if that happened, okay? But potentially you could be ruled that you're at fault if that happened, okay? So there'd be other scenarios like that your job would impose a certain duty towards you if you're, your doctor and patient, things of this nature. But you have a more generalised duty in France, okay? Now, a lot of these duties, they're not incredibly onerous. They're actually just what you'd expect a normal, empathetic human being to do. So one example was that if you're walking along a beach or a seafront and you see someone in trouble in the sea, it doesn't mean that you necessarily have to go in to help that person, but it might mean that you have to call for help. Or if there's a life ring nearby, that you'd throw that ring at least to that person. Whereas if you looked at that person, you thought, oh, what a pity, and simply walked on and ignored the life ring, didn't take out your mobile phone and at least ring someone, that's where you'd fall foul of the criminal law. So it's not overly onersome in some circumstances, but then there does become quite a question as how far the duty extends. And equally, the duty might be somewhat corrupted by your own abilities. If someone's in trouble, for example, a burning building, you or I mightn't have a duty to go inside. But if you happen to be a professional fireman off duty, there might be an argument that, no, you should have gone inside, that you have the knowledge, you have the physical fitness, you have wherever else. Or if someone's in trouble swimming in the sea, if you're an Olympic class swimmer, the obligation on you might be more than on someone else. So it's not an objective standard, if you like. And that's where there's a certain amount of confusion which arises. And equally, there's a question of knowing what the risk is. For my case, for example, something like a criminal assault or a criminal attack, you do have an obligation to stop the attack if you can, or to assist if you can, but you don't actually have an obligation to put yourself in danger. But trying to evaluate that in a split second is somewhat impossible. And equally, most of us are going to feel some sort of a moral burden. And I suppose my own position when I looked at my own case was think that the law needs to try and recognise the people who acted within the spirit of that obligation, whether or not they actually, strictly speaking, went above and beyond what the law requires of me.
Tell us how your compensation claim was dealt with by the state.
Well, I made a statement to the police the day after the assault. I made a statement on the 17th of November. My own injuries, they hadn't really become fully apparent at that time. I told them that the young man, he had not attacked me, which was true. He'd only attacked the girl. He was really quite transfixed on her, and all his aggression was focused on the young lady. So he didn't look at me really until we'd freed the young lady, if you like, until she was out of the picture. I didn't actually press charges against him. At the time, I didn't see myself as a victim, if you like. And in my statement, I told the police that I'd hurt my hand, but it wasn't a serious injury. I didn't think I needed to see a doctor, which was an error, which was a big error on my part, because it only became apparent the extent of my injury much later. It was a little bit later I became aware of it. And it was several months later I was diagnosed with PTSD. So I wasn't fully aware of the problem at the time. And I suppose there's probably a little bit that you're actually in denial about it. Do you know? It was a very strange set of circumstances, and it does sound an unusual thing to say, but in the 2 weeks following that incident, I found myself asking myself, did that actually happen at all? Or did I imagine it? And I'm looking at a puffy hand. No, it did happen, you know. So
the police didn't advise you to see a doctor?
They did. I will say that. They did. At the scene, the police officer told me, go see a doctor. And I was like, okay, but it didn't really register, you know. It was just, my head was spinning really, you know. So it was later on, it became more apparent that I did have a problem with my hand when I went to get a series of scans to try and get to the bottom of it. Ultimately, it was this injury to the tendon, and that meant it wouldn't show up in an x-ray, etc. So it was quite a while before I actually got an accurate diagnosis. And during that time, I rang the police. I asked them, look, my hand injury is much more serious than I had indicated in the initial statement. And I asked them, do I need to change my statement? And this officer, he said no. And that advice was just wrong. That was just incorrect. And because I didn't actually make a complaint at that time, I was more or less kept in the dark about the rest of the proceedings. If I had a registered complaint or whatever, or pressed charges against the young man involved, I could have been recognised as what's called a partie civile to the criminal proceedings. And then what had more success. Now, I attempted to become recognised as partie civile later. And with those papers, I submitted maybe 60, 70 pages of medical evidence. And in the actual judgment, it seemed that the judge did not read any of that evidence, and it made some reference to my initial statement where the hand injury wasn't serious. So he said he wasn't going to receive this claim, etc. And then after that, I tried another procedure, which is the Fond de Garantie, which is another body which deals with people injured in this type of circumstances. Their ruling was that I was not a victim of a crime because this young man had not attacked me. Now, my lawyer's argument was that under the non-assistance, the duty we're talking about, that under that obligation, if the state obliges people to help others to get involved in a criminal scenario like that, the state has a duty to protect that person or indemnify them if they get hurt. But ultimately, they said under the legislation that no, that wasn't the case. So,
you were saying that the French have this concept of solidarity, and that it's very ingrained in French philosophy and culture, that community to help each other.
Yeah, well, that's where that, if you like, the generalised duty, if you like, sort of comes from. It is a very French concept, which, to be very brutally honest about it, that's part of why I find it so disappointing that they wouldn't live up to that ideal when it comes to something like this. And that I think really that's why I did a couple of public interviews about it, because it's not so much just about my case, it's about what happens next. I mean, what happens 3 months from now, and another scenario like this arises. And if you have people thinking, well, I just can't afford to get hurt because I've got young children at home or whatever, I don't want to get involved in that. It's not a particularly good precedent to set, or it's not a good state of affairs. And I mean, it's one of those things, to get involved in something like that, it's going to depend on your circumstances. There's a certain physicality to it. Like I'm 43 now, 10, 15 years from now, I probably wouldn't be fit to do that, do you know? So it's probably an onus that's put on younger people, if you like. And that's a debate we're having in a lot of societies. We're talking a lot about violence against women and girls. There's a lot of publicity, there's a lot of campaigns, and if you see incorrect behaviour, you need to step up, etc., which I don't think is a bad message or a bad sentiment. We need to think that through. What comes after that? Do you know, if somebody does try to do the right thing and they get hurt, they lose out, well, if the state is, even if it's just a moral message, if the state has put that pressure on and delivered that moral message, then the state has some sort of obligation to help that person. And if they're not going to do it, well, we'll have to wonder about the sincerity of the message in the first place.
I was going to ask how you felt this whole experience from the attack itself and also then your years-long process since then. Do you think it's changed how you think about criminal law, both, you know, from an academic perspective and from a personal one?
Yeah, I think I've begun to see a number of shortfalls even in the investigation process. I think if I had never really pursued a few answers about what's going on or asked about my own case, I would never have been contacted again by the authorities. It just wouldn't have arisen. I wasn't. The young man concerned, he was ultimately declared insane, but his hearings, I was never called to give any evidence, which I find very surprising, to be honest, very surprising indeed. And I'm not even fully aware or fully clear why that's the case. You'd have to ask a criminal practitioner within the French system, do you know? But I was quite surprised as to how this was done, and even the likes of advice or discussion from the police. Now, I didn't speak about any of this publicly until after the prosecution case against the young man was finished, which I wasn't aware of it until it was finished. And after my own case had failed, I first gave an interview, but I didn't think it was a good idea to speak about any such case while it's ongoing. But there was no advice from the police on that front. And the police didn't tell me, oh, you know, don't write about this in social media. Nothing like that was ever said. And there wasn't as much as a FAQ sort of sheet to give to someone opposite. There was just very little advice.
Did you have any hope maybe that your own experience might contribute in any way to the broader legal debate on the duty to act?
Well, I mean, that's why I did the initial interview. I did an interview with Le Progrès. It'd be a big newspaper of the region around Lyon. It'd be the Lyonnais publication. They're national papers, obviously, but it would be the big Lyonnais one, that fairly politically central, maybe slightly centre-left, but fairly down the middle, you know. And it's really more about, it's about its region. So I did an interview, and yeah, the reason I did it was because I don't think that should happen to anybody else, you know. And if we are, and so it's one of those things in the metros in Lyon, there's announcements every 5 minutes and posters up about, you know, the sort of behaviour, the harassment of women and stuff. And again, if we're going to put that pressure on people, we'll have to think it through, and we'll have to, you know, if we're asking people to protect other people, then the state's going to have to protect the people who do the protecting, if you will.
In the UK, we have a different philosophy. We don't generally punish omissions, and there's a more, you know, personal autonomy about whether you're going to get involved unless you have a special relationship with the potential victim. But do you think that there is any point in codifying this duty to protect? Does it make any real difference?
I'm not actually 100% sure, but what I do feel is we have, even in the common law tradition, the common law culture, we have been pushing that message for 10 years now. Largely since the beginning of the Me Too campaign. And I know we're largely talking today about violence against women and girls, but it's equally true. You know, if a young lad's getting attacked for no good reason, or an older person, or, you know, even it's an example of children, you know, they should stop in and stop, you know, a young child from being bullied, or it could be a girl being attacked by other girls. So it's all the same. But if we are pushing that message, and it is the state that's pushing that message, you know, like we're seeing these type of notices. And in a little talk we gave earlier, I referred to a post that was from the PSNI about this type of behaviour, and if we see it, we should stop it. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I don't disagree with the ethic or value behind that post. I think I agree with it on a moral level. Mm-hmm. But if agencies of the state are going to start pushing the message, then we need to have a conversation as to what is the state's role in all of this.
Yeah.
And if we're going to tell you, and it is mostly young men, you have to step up and stop this, well then what's the duty towards the young if he suffers the consequences for that action?
And have you found there is public or maybe political will to make those modifications to the law?
In France, it's none whatsoever. There's been no response to the interviews I did. I would advocate for a more simplified system, because when I started on this, looking at it, I was just completely clueless. I was completely lost, and nobody seemed in a position to actually even give me clear advice. I think that would have to start with the police, and I don't say this in the spirit of blaming or vilifying individual police. I'm more talking about a system. Do you know? I think every police officer I met involved in this was quite a decent individual. Do you know? But I'm talking more of having a system in place where, you know, this person's been in this position, this happened. As I say, what I mentioned earlier, even if you had as much as a frequently asked questions sheet that you could give to that person, but they clearly don't. Do you know, that position's not there. There's very little information online, if you like. You know, it's really not all that evident what your options are in such a scenario, you know.
Thank you very much, Eoin Campbell. It's a very compelling story, and I've no doubt if you had to go back and do it again, you would.
Yeah, I would. Yeah, of course, I think I would. Yeah, not a very pleasant experience. I've had people tell me, "Oh, you should be proud of that and stuff," and you can't really feel like that, because it was a pretty disgusting sort of thing to witness and be part of. So it's not like, you know, when I was a wee boy, I thought the things I'd be proud of was, you know, score a goal in the All-Ireland final for Down, you know. And if you did that, you'd probably, or, you know, if you're a rugby man, you score the try, or football, you score the winning goal, or knock out the guy to become heavyweight champion. You know, these things you might look back on with pride. It's very, very unpleasant, but I'm somewhat reassured I did the right thing, if you like.
It's not often that we have someone who has actually saved a life on LawPod, so thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Telling us your story and giving us plenty of food for thought about the duty to intervene to save someone in danger.